Pre-Flight Playbook here at Newark Airport, Terminal C, in front of Vesper Tavern. And I'm Gary Myers, and I'm really pleased to welcome my guests. A little bit different than the athletes and coaches that we've had so far, but a very recognizable face, a very recognizable voice in Kenny Albert, the only broadcaster in the country, I think, that does all four of the major sports. So you've seen him everywhere. Well, welcome, Kenny. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks, Gary. My biggest athletic achievement might be the fact that I got 15 points off John Smoltz in a ping pong match. From what I'm told, during John's entire major league career, he only lost once.
Really?
And that was to a Tigers minor leaguer during his days in Detroit. And we were out at a Fox seminar one year, and some of the other guys that I work with, Eric Karros, set up this match. He heard I was bragging about my ping pong prowess and actually got 15 points off John Smoltz.
And did he get 21 or did you play to 15?
He did get to 21, but it was a moral victory.
Now, he's very competitive. How did he handle that?
Well, we played 2 more games. I think I went down to 12 and then 8. So he took care of me pretty handily in games 2 and 3.
You have done games with him.
I actually have not.
Oh, you haven't done any? Okay.
Never worked one with John.
I looked at the list of all the partners you've had in all these sports, and it was too long to memorize. I thought maybe he'd be on the list, but now talking about baseball a little bit, the World Series going on, and you've done a lot of games for Fox over the course of the season. You did some playoff games, you did some Astros games. What is your feeling about the state of the actual baseball? It seems that it was juiced during the year, that I don't want to say check swings were going over the fence, opposite field, but it seemed that way. But in the playoffs, the home runs are not being hit at the same rate. First of all, do you think the ball was juiced during the season, and do you think they de-juiced it in the playoffs?
Well, it's a good question. I guess we'll never know, but the numbers were crazy during the regular season. You had, I think, 10 teams set franchise records for home runs. 3 teams hit more home runs this year than the record, which was set last year. Justin Verlander certainly had some interesting comments about it during the All-Star break. But as far as the Astros, I worked their first series against the Tampa Bay Rays. They were obviously impressive, although the Rays did extend it to a 5-game series, going with the opener throughout the season, I think 43 times, and we saw it in that first round series, and you had to be impressed with what the Rays did. But when you have a Verlander and a Cole 1-2 in the rotation, pretty tough to get by the Astros in a full series, as the Yankees were unable to do, losing in 6, and now Houston and Washington involved in a terrific World Series.
You know, Kenny, I'm more of a traditionalist, and I've been following baseball my entire life. It's hard for me to believe that these teams that make it as far as the Yankees and the Astros do not have a 4th starter that they would feel comfortable putting out there in a Game 6, that instead each team threw about 6 different pitchers in a crucial game. What has happened to baseball and to pitching that the 4th starter now is basically a guy you don't trust anymore?
It is amazing, isn't it? Back when we were growing up, you would never see that. You never heard of a relief pitcher starting a game, although back then Goose Gossage would come in and pitch 3 innings of relief and pick up the save. So things were a lot different then. It worked for the Rays. They had a better winning percentage in the regular season when they used the opener than when they used the traditional starting pitcher. But when you have, whether it's a Verlander and a Cole on the Houston side, Strasburg and Scherzer and Sanchez and Corbin.
We just do things on the fly.
There you go. The Nationals certainly don't have that problem, but it is a lot different than the 70s and 80s when we were growing up.
And what do you think about the way that analytics is kind of taken over the sport? The Astros are a big analytics team. The Nationals, not so much. So you have really contrasting styles in the World Series we've been watching.
I love it when a team is in the shift and you see a player lay down a bunt or get a base hit to a wide open shortstop, third base area. You know where it's become confusing on the scorecard when you keep score. If a player grounds out to the shortstop and he's over at the second base position, it's still 6-3, but he's at the 4. So what do you do? But we've seen it in all sports, the analytics, whether baseball, football, hockey, basketball. I guess football is the one sport where it's been going on forever. As you know, coaches never sleep, and throughout the week they'll study every 4th and 15 play, every 3rd and 12. So that's analytics. But the other sports have caught up in recent years, and you hear about all these newfangled statistics and analytical phrases used in just about every sport, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, or hockey. And with technology now and computers, you can call up, it's not Vince Lombardi splicing film together. And I think I read an article where Bill Belichick said that he saves 3 or 4 hours a day, at least, compared to back in the 70s and 80s, just because of technology. At one click of a button, you can watch every third down that the Patriots have had throughout the season, where back in the day, it's assistant coaches splicing film together.
Absolutely, and I mean, I've been doing this so long, I remember those days. We'd walk into a coach's office, and they'd have the old projectors there, and then it progressed to on the DVD players and the CD, whatever, and now it's just so advanced. I can understand how.
I mean, even from a broadcasting standpoint, when I started with Fox in 1994, on Tuesday or Wednesday, I would get a package in the mail with VHS tapes of each team's previous game, whichever teams I had that week. About 10 years later, it became DVDs, and we get it on Tuesday. Now you can take your iPad and go to the NFL Game Pass and watch any game you want that's been played the last 10 years. You can record it off DirecTV at home, so things are a lot easier these days.
Because you just transitioned a little bit to football, let me ask you this. I know you did the Cardinals-Giants game, then you have the Giants and the Lions, and then you're going out, the game's in Seattle, you're going to?
Tampa Bay, Seattle next week.
Okay, and then you got the Giant-Jet game, which everybody here in New York just can't wait for that game. But take me through a typical week for you in terms of preparing for an NFL game, because there's really so much information available to you now that you really have to be discerning in how you decide what you want to bring into the booth with you, what actually winds up on the air. So you know your assignments in advance, but starting, say, Monday of this week, how did your preparation start for Giants-Lions?
Well, the preparation from a broadcast standpoint for football is so much more voluminous than the other sports. In basketball or hockey or baseball, they're playing 3 to 4 games a week, every day, 6 days a week in baseball. Football, it's 1 game a week, but we could have myself and my partner, whether it's Greg Olson last week, Charles Davis this week, Rondé Barber next week, we might have 2 teams that we haven't seen all season. Now, that's not the case. I've done the Giants, haven't done the Lions. I've done both Tampa Bay and Seattle. So it's a lot easier when it's a repeat team.
Sure.
Because you've done the basic preparation. But usually I'll start on a Monday and I'll lay out my charts. Everybody has their own system. I'll put the players by position. You fill in different biographical information, height, weight, college, statistics, how many years they've been in the league. And that's just to help me when I watch the previous game. Yesterday I watched the first half of the Lions-Vikings from last week. So I have the team in front of me, the depth chart.
Do you watch the TV tape, or are you watching the...
I definitely watch the TV tape. Once in a while I'll watch the coach's tape, but I think that's more for the analyst. A lot of times I don't really know what I'm looking for on the coach's tape, although I've learned a lot by spending so much time with my analysts through the years. But for me, it's more about identifying the players, the names, numbers, hearing the stories about them, seeing where they're lined up on the field, how they're used by the coaches, and you start to formulate those storylines. A lot of reading as well. I'll read every article written in both cities about those teams that week. By Wednesday, you get packets in the mail from each team, also emailed now with the weekly press release, with various statistics from the NFL and the different services they use. So from Monday to Thursday, I'm really on my own, whether I'm home, whether I'm traveling for other sports, just going through all this information. It's like studying for an open book test.
Sure.
And then once Sunday comes, you really only use 5 to 10% of your information because you want to let the game dictate what we talk about. Friday, we'll go to the home team practice. So this Friday, we'll go to the Lions practice, watch practice, and then we'll sit down with 3 or 4 players and coaches. Matt Patricia, 1 or 2 of the coordinators, usually the quarterback and 1 defensive player. And some of it's strategy related. Some coaches will tell you more than others. A lot of it's just background stories. You know, you'll turn on a game on Sunday and you'll hear us say, well, we spoke to so-and-so and they told us this or that. A prime example is when Daniel Jones started his first game for the Giants against Tampa back in September.
Right.
And we had Pat Shurmur in the room, and knowing that Pat's son is a quarterback now on the Kansas City Chiefs roster, elevated from the practice squad.
He's the backup guy now.
Backup quarterback with the Mahomes injury. I asked Pat Shurmur if his son Kyle had any time at camps with Daniel Jones, if they knew each other. It turns out they were roommates.
Yes.
So here you have Daniel Jones starting his first game for the Giants, and his roommate at the the Manning Passing Academy,
right.
not only Peyton, but the entire Manning family. Ironically, he replaces Eli, and his roommate at the Manning camp was his head coach's son. So it kind of all tied in together, and we use that story on the game. So we'll meet with the home team Friday, the visiting team Saturday. We'll go over to their hotel when they get into the city, and we'll have our own production meeting at night where we talk about the various storylines. We'll look at the graphics and the video packages, and then once they kick off on Sunday, like I said, you let the game dictate. You might not use 5% of the information, but you have to have it all up here.
I know that you've probably done a majority of the NFC teams, a majority of your games are the NFC teams. But I think people would be curious in these coaches sessions that you have meeting with the teams, whether you've sat with Belichick and how forthcoming he is.
About 5 or 6 games through the years with New England. As you said, with Fox, we do mostly NFC games, but if the NFC team is the away team visiting the Patriots, those games are on Fox. We've had some great meetings with Bill Belichick. You kind of know going in not to really ask specific questions about his current team because he's not really going to give much.
Right.
But as you know from spending a lot of time around him, I'm sure, once you get him going on the history of the game, on the 80s Giants, the 75 Baltimore Colts, which is his first coaching job, even the 64 Naval Academy football team. I did a game with Moose Johnston and Tony Siragusa in New England, and Moose was on the Super Bowl committee in Dallas right before the Super Bowl was at Jerry World. And Roger Staubach was also on the committee, and they happened to run into each other that week. And Roger Staubach asked Moose Johnston to pass along his regards to Coach Belichick, whose father obviously coached at the Naval Academy.
Sure.
So Moose mentions this to Bill. That led to about a half-hour dissertation on everything he learned from the 1964 Naval Academy football team where his father, Steve, was a head coach. And it was great just to sit there and listen and soak it up. But if you want to get too in-depth on his current team, you probably won't get too much. But the stories about Lawrence Taylor and the 80s Giants are tremendous.
I always enjoyed it when on the injury reports, if somebody had a bad ankle, Belichick wouldn't even tell you which leg it was.
Right.
He wouldn't even tell you that Tom Brady is starting this weekend. But you want to ask him about the evolution of the tight end in the NFL. Like you said, he'll give you a dissertation on that. Do you find that he'll talk to you at all, even off the record, once he's gotten to know you a little bit and built up that trust?
You know, I think perhaps with some of the analysts who were former players, I remember working with a couple of different guys, and they get him off to the side, and he would definitely give them a little
Kenny,
more
let me
information.
rephrase that. Let's not put it all on Belichick. Just in general with these coaches, once you got around the league a few times, and we know the coaches change a lot, but once you've done a guy's games 2 or 3 times, can you sense that when you walk in the 4th time and he's already maybe told you a tidbit or two, they said this is off the record, and you didn't use it, and he knows he can trust you? Do you find they're a little more open with you at that point?
Yeah, certain guys for sure, some more so than others. Oftentimes you get really good information from the assistant coaches, the coordinators, because they want you to talk about them and promote them on television, and that could lead to them getting a head coaching job. So on many occasions, it's the assistant coaches who you get some of the good stuff from.
I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but just off the top of your head, what are the coaches that you find, they're really informative, that they're entertaining, they might tell you a really good behind-the-scenes story that will be something that the viewers will want to hear?
Just off the top of my head, Jeff Fisher was always a coach who would share a lot of information, good stories. Once in a while, he might give you a heads up about a trick play he was thinking about running, just so we're prepared for it. And that's the trust level where he knows that you're not going to tell anybody, and if you did, you'd probably lose your job.
Right.
But he was always one of the great ones. Always enjoyed Andy Reid. Had many games in Philadelphia through the years, a couple in Kansas City. And there have been others as well, but off the top of my head, those are probably the first 2.
I would imagine Rex was fun if you had any Rex games.
Especially if you had Tony Siragusa in the room, who played for Rex.
Oh, sure.
He was Tony's position coach in Baltimore. So whenever you got Goose together with, and that coaching staff had Rex Ryan, Marvin Lewis, a number of others, Mike Smith, a number of others who went on to be head coaches in the NFL. So whenever you got those guys together, it was a lot of fun.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that I really don't know the answer to, despite the fact that I've been in this business for a while. How do you know when to go down to the sideline reporter? Do they buzz up and say, I got something? Do you have a set time in each quarter that you go down to? How's that work?
Well, with Goose, it was different because he was our, quote, sideline analyst.
Right.
And his mic was open. He can come in at any time, and I was always amazed.
That was dangerous, I would imagine.
Well, I was always amazed that, I would set up the play, I would call the play, and then I would shut up and get out of the way because I had two analysts, Moose upstairs, Goose downstairs. I was always amazed how little they talked over each other, or stepped on each other, as we say in the business. They had this great sense of knowing when the other one wanted to get in. But that was different because his mic was open all the time. With the traditional sideline reporter, and I've worked with a lot of them, a lot of it is set up in the truck by the producer. If there's an injury, obviously, that's a key time when they'll come in, but they'll also have 5 or 6 or 8 to 10 preconceived stories they might want to get into during the game if it's relevant. So that's usually set up by the producer. He'll say after the play, let's go down to so-and-so if nothing big happens. But with Goose, it was a lot different with the open mic.
Now, I know you say you do a lot of research. I've done my research too. January 3rd, 2007, LSU Notre Dame
Sugar
Bowl. Your analysts were Terry Bradshaw and Howie Long.
Yep.
How did you handle that?
That was so much fun working with those guys. And I had such a good feeling coming out of that telecast from a TV standpoint that I never went back and watched it. Oftentimes I'll go back and watch a game and you might have talked too much during a certain situation. You might have used the same phrase too many times. Certain things, you're always your own worst critic.
Sure.
But I had such a good feeling coming out of that game that I'd never gone back and watched it. Howie Long's kids were in the truck that day. Chris Long was, I think, either about to get drafted or had just gotten drafted by the Rams.
Right.
Kyle Long was still in high school, so I remember meeting those guys for the first time that day, and now Chris is retired, has 2 Super Bowls. Kyle's had a great career with the Bears. But leading up to that game, the amount of prep, the college game's a lot tougher, and I've only done 5 or 6 of them when Fox used to have the BCS bowl games.
Why is it tougher?
90 players on each side.
Sure.
You're not as familiar with the players as you are with the NFL. You're not as familiar with the history of the schools. But you also have 3 or 4 weeks because they don't play. They play at the end of November, beginning of December, and then don't play again. So you have more time. And we would go to each school and meet with players and coaches and study. So there was a much bigger element of time than there is before an NFL game. But we would also, for the 2 or 3 weeks leading up to it, we also went, that was the year that the pregame show for Fox was traveling. Joe Buck was hosting the show, and they would go to wherever his game was. So Howie and Terry and Jimmy Johnson were on the road every week. So for a couple of weeks, I would go do my NFL meetings on Friday. Then on Saturday, we would fly once to Charlotte, once to the Meadowlands, and do sort of a rehearsal with Howie and Terry, because Howie had never been in a broadcast booth, in a game booth before. He'd only been in the studio.
Sure.
So he didn't know the mechanics. He didn't know what the cough button was, how to put on the headset.
That's what Joe was hosting the pregame on the college games? Or
Joe was hosting the NFL pregame that one season.
Oh, okay.
So
that's right.
He and Howie and Terry and Jimmy would be on the road every Sunday.
Right.
They did it via remote. So we would go to wherever they were, and then I would go up to the booth with Howie and Terry, and we would have a game on the monitor that had been played previously, and we'd do a mock game just to get them into the flow. Terry hadn't done a game in like 15 years since the CBS days.
Right.
Howie had never done a game, but those guys were so good. They were so great.
Did you sit between them, or were you off?
That's a good question. I think I was on the left, and then they were next to each other.
So I was going to say.
Because they were used to being next to each other in the studio. But it was not a game to remember if you're a Notre Dame fan. It was close at halftime, 17-14. It was Brady Quinn and Jamarcus Russell, and LSU ran away with it in the second half. But that was a fun night. Terry was on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno 2 nights later, and they actually talked about the broadcast. He mentioned all of us, so that was a lot of fun.
Did you have to put a seatbelt on Terry?
No, he was great. He was tremendous to work with, a lot of fun, and I think he kept himself in check for the most part, but it was a really fun night.
Have you done many college games since then, or?
No, only 5 or 6 total. Fox doesn't have the BCS anymore, but I wound up working 1 other Sugar Bowl game, 1 Cotton Bowl, and 1 Orange Bowl, and had Barry Alvarez, the athletic director at Wisconsin, as the third man in the booth with Moose Johnston on 1 or 2 of them. Also did the BCS championship game, Tebow against Bradford. I didn't do the main telecast. We did a 3D telecast, believe it or not. Wow. I don't know how many people watched. It might have been in the low hundreds, but it was fun to be there down in Miami. And if you had 3D glasses at the time, you would get a big kick out of whatever we were doing that night.
So those guys who, because they're NFL guys, and then they had to adjust to the college game, did you find that their preparation equaled yours, that they were really into the game?
I was impressed with how much preparation they did. Yeah. They came to the schools for the meetings, LSU and Notre Dame. Turns out there was a running back on LSU that we figured out Terry was a distant relative of. He wound up playing in the NFL. I can't think of his name, but I think he played for the Chargers. But he was actually a distant relative of Terry, so we had some fun with that on the broadcast.
Okay. This is from a 2014 story by Neil Best, who writes for Newsday, talking about your travel schedule, because I think you were doing the Western Conference Finals on TV and the Eastern Conference Finals, because the Rangers were in it,
right,
on the radio. He called the game in Chicago on Sunday, Montreal Monday, Chicago Wednesday, New York Thursday, Los Angeles Saturday, New York Sunday, Los Angeles Monday, after which he used to take a red-eye flight back to New York, then travel to Montreal on Tuesday and Chicago on Wednesday. Are you nuts?
Yes. that was a crazy 2-week stretch. You just run on adrenaline at that point. Game every night, travel. And just to give you some of the background on that, NBC had asked me to work the Western Conference Final that year for the first time, which was a huge honor.
Sure.
And I've done it every year since. And as the radio voice of the Rangers, we go all the way through in the playoffs. TV, the local team guys only work the first round, but on the radio, you go all the way through.
Sure.
So that was 2014. The Rangers hadn't been in the conference finals since 97. It had been a while. Obviously, I'd love for them to go as far as possible. It's better for us.
Sure.
We get to do more games. If you're part of a team that wins a championship, it's a lot of fun, obviously. But when NBC had asked me about the Western Finals, the odds of the Rangers getting there, they hadn't been to the conference finals since 97.
Right.
So, of course, that year, actually, I shouldn't say that. They were there in 2012, but before that, it was 97.
Okay.
So it had been once in the last 15 years. They played the New Jersey Devils in the conference final in 12. So schedule comes out, and it all worked out, going back and forth between LA, Chicago, New York, Montreal, and worked all but one game. I couldn't work the first game in Montreal because we didn't know what time the game would be the next day. Would it be an afternoon game? We didn't know where it would be, depending on who won the previous round. But wound up working 12 of those 13 games. I've had some other crazy stretches, but this one probably takes the cake.
Now, this has happened to me, and I never traveled as much as that. Sometimes I would actually wake up in a hotel room, and it would take me 5 or 10 seconds to remember exactly where I was,
right,
which city I was in. And again, I didn't travel at that kind of pace. I have to imagine that there were some mornings that you woke up and you just really had to gather yourself before you remembered where you were.
It happened once recently. There was an early morning. There are some early morning flights at times throughout the year. And the alarm went off at like 5 a.m. And it did take me about 30 seconds to figure out where I am, why the alarm went off at 5, and where I'm going. It kicked in pretty quickly. What I've started to do now with the camera phone is actually take a picture of the room number in the hotel, because sometimes if you're in 3 or 4 hotel rooms a week, sometimes your mind reverts to the previous city and room numbers. So it used to be, they'll give you the key and they'll write the room on the little cardboard folder. You stick that in your pocket. Now you just take a picture of the hotel room number. That's
smart. You do that in airport garages too. I do that all the time.
I did it half an hour ago in the airport garage here. I'm parked in 110.
Okay. You must have a very understanding wife.
I do. No, she's great. We met back in '94, and she sort of knew what she was getting into at the time. I was doing hockey and football, not as much baseball yet or basketball, but my wife and my kids, they're so used to it. The kids don't know any different. Home a lot in the summer. The one thing when my kids were young, I am home more during the week than fathers who go to an office every day from 9 to 5, don't get home till 7 o'clock at night. So I was able to do a lot of the activities on weekdays that most fathers can't do, as I'm sure you probably did as well, given your profession as a newspaper reporter. But not a lot of weekends home, so missed some of that stuff. But I didn't mind the schedule because, like I said, I was home for a lot of the activities during the week.
So talking about family, obviously I have to bring this part up, and if people don't know it, because you've certainly made a name for yourself, and a younger generation just knows you as Kenny Albert, but people like me who grew up with my radio under the pillow listening to your dad do Ranger games on Sunday night, it's no surprise that in the Albert household, where your Uncle Steve and your Uncle Al were also broadcasters, your dad Marv, the greatest basketball announcer of all time. What was it like? I know your parents bought you your first tape recorder when you were like 4 or 5 years old, and you were just destined to do this.
Well, first of all, you get an A+, Gary, because multiple times a week I get the question, so are you one of the brothers? Who's your father? Who's your brother? So you have the lineage down pat. Did get a tape recorder when I was 5 and started announcing games into the recorder, and when I was old enough I would bring it to Shea Stadium or Madison Square Garden, but really from that point on, knew what I wanted to do, and I had such a great teacher in the house, and it wasn't like we sat down and had lessons. It was more via osmosis. I would watch how he prepares, and that was really the biggest thing I learned was the preparation.
Yeah.
And I would watch games and listen to games, and when I was old enough, I would start tagging along and doing stats for him. So really nothing that I would trade in. It was such a great experience, and similar to my schedule, he wasn't around a lot during the week or on weekends, but some of my greatest memories as a youngster were going to Ranger games and Knick games and NFL games, and he was also doing the 6 and 11 o'clock sports for Channel 4, WNBC. So I would tag along to the studio and help rip the wire copy off the UPI and AP wire machines, and just so many memories from my childhood of tagging along, like I said, and just learning so much during those days.
I always ask players whose dads were in the NFL and then they followed in their footsteps, whether their fathers, Eli obviously was a prime example. How much did Archie encourage him or push him in that direction? And, Archie was really a hands-off dad, and it just turns out 2 of his sons had great football ability and went on to win Super Bowls.
And I hear there's a grandson who's pretty good now, too.
I know, and that's Cooper's son.
Right.
His name is Arch. He's a freshman at the same high school that Eli and Peyton went to. And
Odell.
And Odell. And he's actually starting as a freshman, which Eli and Peyton were on the JV or freshman team as a freshman. And Archie always talks about how he just wanted his kids to be kids and have fun, and whatever they decide to do was fine. The fact that you had this great interest and you had a dad who was, so successful and an icon in the business, how did that mesh? Did your dad encourage you, push you, let you just be a kid? Where did your motivation come from?
Really never pushed at all, not once, but probably realized at a young age how interested I was in it. Yeah. Also did a lot of writing, starting in 8th grade for the town paper on Long Island, wound up as the sports editor for the school paper, high school paper for 2 years, and also had a wonderful experience when I was in 10th grade. A local cable station, Cox Cable, came to my high school to film a girls' basketball game, and I was there to cover the game as a reporter, and met the producer before the game and volunteered. He didn't have any announcers. They were just going to film the game, and he clipped a microphone on me and wound up announcing that game, and called him the next day, and for the next 3 years, I got to do like 100 games, all the different sports.
Wow.
On this little cable station. I would bring my friends along as color analysts. So I felt like I had a 3-year head start on others my age who wanted to do it in college. And there weren't as many opportunities back then. You didn't have the internet, you didn't have these broadcasting camps.
Sure.
So I really felt fortunate to get involved with Cox Cable from such a young age. But to get back to the original question, never pushed me at all, but I'm sure realized the passion I had for it, and started taking me around, like I said, to the games. And
I remember him talking about you on the radio when you were 10 years old.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the Olympics with him. I did stats at the Dream Team games in '92.
Wow.
I was there for the boxing that he did in '88. So, but I think a lot of learning via osmosis, like I said.
How much of your style would you say is like your dad's. I mean, you do sound like him. I'm sure.
It's funny. Some people think so. Some people don't. Nothing that I purposely did style-wise, but there are probably some phrases and maybe some voice inflections that do sound similar, but that's really nothing that I do consciously, I guess.
So now he's basically just doing the TNT stuff now, right?
TNT basketball. He had the opener Tuesday night in Toronto. Raptors got their rings against New Orleans,
Right.
so it's normally one game a week for Turner during the regular season, and then first 3 rounds of the playoffs.
So you're much busier than he is these days.
These days, although I'll take his schedule from the late 70s through the mid 90s, and I'm sure it's in my DNA, all the travel and different sports and the number of games throughout the year. He was doing it back then, plus the local news on WNBC.
I mean, this is probably a question for him, but he just must be so proud of you that that you've gone on and followed in his footsteps and just had a great career. That you're probably just in the middle of your career now, but you've had a great career. He must be really thrilled for you.
And like I said, he does love introducing me as his brother these days. And the one thing I always tell everybody, you mentioned my uncles, Al and Steve.
Yeah.
I think back to those times in the 70s and 80s when they would come over to our house or we would get together somewhere for holidays. And when I think back, that was like the first all-sports radio station. I'd sit there as a kid and listen to them, and they'd be telling stories about the various games and teams they were working for at the time, and they probably could have taped it and put it on the air somewhere, those discussions.
He obviously brought the word yes into the vernacular, and one. I think he was the first one to do it. Now there's a sneaker company, or there was.
Yep.
A sneaker company. Have you, when you do basketball at all, in your announcing, do you ever feel the need to hold yourself back from saying yes?
I never really thought about it. That's a good question. There probably aren't too many people that do say it, aside from him. Although, a funny story, when my older daughter was real young and started teaching her about the yes and the whole thing, she would purposely, if we were out to dinner with him or anywhere with him, she would purposely go up to him and start saying no. When she was 2 or 3 years old, she'd just keep repeating the word no. So he got a big kick out of that.
Before I finish up with you, the best thing about being at the airport right now is when we're done, you don't have to walk down to a gate, which has got to be a welcome change for you.
I will be here a week from tomorrow for that flight to Seattle, though.
Okay. So I know you love hockey, but if I was to say to you right now, here's your choice, Kenny, and it's Kenny Albert. I forgot to reintroduce ourselves from Pre-Flight Playbook here at Terminal C at Newark Airport in front of Vesper Tavern. But if I'm saying to you, here's your choice, and you can only do one. You got the Super Bowl, the 7th game of the World Series, Game 7 of the NBA Finals, or Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. And let's just make it real easy for you and say none of the local teams from New York are in it. So you can make a really objective call here. Which one, obviously the Super Bowl, you had the most viewers, but which one would get that adrenaline going the most?
It's a great question, and I've been real fortunate to be involved on different levels with many of the top events. I've done the Stanley Cup on Westwood One Radio now for the last 4 years. Did it twice back in the 90s, once for the Rangers. So I've been involved in 7 Stanley Cup finals on the radio. Did 1 game on TV in 2014 during the final. Worked 1 Super Bowl, the international broadcast, the world feed with Joe Theismann. So again, it wasn't on in the U.S., but it was on everywhere else. It was the Giants, Patriots, most recent in Indianapolis.
Right.
So I have been involved to different extents with the Super Bowl, Stanley Cup final. Would hate to have to choose.
This is a different way of me asking the question of what's your favorite sport.
Right, and I always say it's like asking which kid you like better, if you have 4. Fortunate to be involved in all 4, plus a little bit of boxing too. As a kid, hockey was my favorite. Played hockey a little bit, wasn't very good. Played on a club team at NYU, club team in high school. My goal as a youngster was to do hockey on the radio, which I wound up doing at a pretty young age. Never imagined, and we don't have enough time, for the whole genesis of it, but never imagined I'd be involved in the NFL, at all as a broadcaster. And Rupert Murdoch winds up bidding on the rights, takes it away from CBS. They hire a bunch of young guys at the time, myself, Joe Buck, Tom Brenneman.
Yeah.
We're all still there 25 years later. But, I think as a broadcaster, any sports broadcaster, no matter what sport they're working, would probably tell you that the Super Bowl would be the one. Over 100 million viewers. Who doesn't watch the Super Bowl?
Sure.
So did the one world feed, but an opportunity to do it on a network. I think you'd have to put that at the top of the list, but the Stanley Cup final, not too far behind, and had the chance to do one game on TV in the final. It wasn't a Game 7. I've done a couple of Game 7s on the radio, so I've gotten a taste of that as well.
Last question, Kenny. You've done a bunch of Olympics. What is the one event that you've done that really sticks out in your mind?
As far as the Olympics?
Yeah.
It's the women's gold medal hockey game
Really?
in 2018 in Korea, Pyeongchang. U.S. had not beaten Canada in a long time in Olympic hockey. The U.S. won the gold in '98, and then Canada had a pretty long run, 2002, 6, 10, 14. And just the emotion in that building. It went to a shootout. It went through overtime to a shootout. I've worked 5 Winter Olympics now on TV, a lot of men's hockey, but I'd have to say the one game that stands out is the U.S. women winning the gold medal in Korea.
I've been fascinated how the evolution of women's hockey over the years, that now I think it's I don't know what the ratings are like, but I think it's as anticipated now as the men's, just like in women's soccer has become, in the World Cup, much bigger
Right.
than men's soccer. So it's pretty cool.
And I think in a crazy way, and I love when the NHL goes to the Olympics, and I've been involved, like I said, since 2002. But in a way, I think the fact that the NHL players weren't there in Pyeongchang gave even a grander scale to the women's hockey. And the ratings were huge. The players went on the Today Show the next morning. They're still doing great things. There's a professional league now. A number of them have become commentators on television as well. But I think the fact that the NHL wasn't there even raised the focus on the women's hockey at the Olympics in 18.
Kenny, this has really been fascinating. I know people out there, if you're getting ready to get on your plane, or if you're sitting at home watching on YouTube or Vimeo, that just hearing like the inside part of Kenny's business, I know it's fascinating to me, and I can't thank you enough for stopping by here. This is Pre-Flight Playbook. We're here at Vesper Tavern, so if you're at Newark Airport, please stop by. It's a great sports bar, and it's in Terminal C here at Newark, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Gary. Enjoyed it.